Good evening, everyone. Happy to welcome you here tonight to the report release of Dr. Kuchins' new report that he's done with us, Elevation and Calibration, a new Russia policy for America. And we had hoped to have the president of our board here, Dr. Bruce Blair, tonight. He's a little under the weather, so I'm going to ask you first that you look inside the report when you get it and read his introductory note. I think he conveyed some of the sentiments that many people in this room feel, and I know certainly the members of our panel tonight feel as well, which is that at a time when we're looking at the 25th anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, each generation has their own impressions. I think in particular Dr. Kuchins and his colleagues at the table here have sort of grown up professionally and been through an arc of emotion that's put us at a spot right now where we face what Dr. Blair calls in his introduction sort of uncharted territory in respect to executive decision-making, crisis escalation, and our relationship with Russia from the U.S. perspective. So what we hope the report has done is both provide a lot of depth in that sense that the foundation of the report is built on an exhaustive set of interviews that Andy has conducted both with Russian and U.S. policymakers, analysts, and other folks who have spent their professional lives immersed in this relationship. The breadth of the report, I think, is also impressive in that the recommendations it provide are comprehensive. This is my personal editorial opinion, and maybe I'm biased, it's eminently readable. He's provided a lot of insights that he's called out of his interviews that I think make it exceptionally good reading by Washington, D.C. standards, while yet at the same time still providing, I know that's a low bar, but nonetheless, I think he's met it. And the recommendations are practical, feasible, I think sensible, and they reflect the constraints of diplomacy. They also reflect the fruit, I would say, of debate, argument, and sort of heartfelt exchange of emotional perspectives, if you will. And I've been lucky to be part of that, worked with Andy, appreciate his patience greatly with us, working through it. And we have a talented staffer that's been in support. Olga Kuzminova is the editor. I think she contributed at least as much substantively as she did stylistically. She ensured there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in the report, almost all of which is Andy's. And that's what we kind of expect out of a good editor. Alec Albright is also here, another staff member who's contributed greatly to this. He is our Scandinavian, sort of Northern European American from Minnesota who provides the calm sort of presence that we need from somebody from that part of the world in an organization that has a diverse staff, just like our country does. So with that, I'll pass on my thanks to Dr. Kuchins from Bruce. And those of you who know him or know of him know he's also the co-founder, director of Global Zero, an organization aimed at ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And he's done some fantastic work. He mentioned, and we've included the title in the intro, a report that his organization did last year, 2015, on de-alerting the posture of nuclear weapons worldwide. And it's 170 pages. It's a lot of detail, and I think that's appropriate. It's impressive work, and he feels like this, while not solely focused on averting nuclear crisis or dealing with escalation, it certainly achieves the same aims to achieve the same ends, which is a version of conflict while still pursuing our national interests. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Nikolai Zlobin, our president of CGI, who's an eminent historian, political commentator, been active providing political advice in the Russian Federation, both to the Yeltsin and Gorbachev teams. But I'd also point out, too, that he spends a lot of his time, and he's just back fresh from Moscow, interpreting the U.S. for a Russian audience, which I think our organization pays as much attention to as anybody does. He's recently published a book on the subject for a Russian audience in the Russian language. I don't think it's on sale here in the States. We can get you a copy if you're up for it. But importantly, he provides that perspective and that bridge. And I'm going to let him take over and introduce the panel and move on.
Okay. Mike, thank you. We have seats over here, guys. If you don't want to stay behind, you can sit in the front. Okay, it's your choice. It's free country. Yeah. Well, can you hear me? Sorry for the delay. but we started to adjust you to the Putin's style. Everything starts later. And we scheduled in a way so you can have drink and food before the event, and some maybe during the event. And then after the discussion, we'll have food and drinks again. So it's Russian way as well. So be ready. I personally, make sure that our main speaker had some drinks. So enjoy it. Anyway, I welcome you to Center on Global Interest. We really put a lot of efforts in this report. I know Dr. Kuchins for like quarter of century. And when he was a director of Russian, I guess, Soviet program, right? What it was at Stanford University.
Stanford program in Soviet.
Yeah, it was Soviet. Yeah. He made a mistake by inviting me over there, and like it was not enough, he later, when he held a position at MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, he invited me to Chicago and even managed to give me MacArthur Foundation grant, so I know him for a long time. And I have a lot to blame him for. And as a part of his punishment, I asked him to put together this report, which put him, of course, in very vulnerable position because, to speculate on U.S. Russia future, it's always like too unpredictable. But Andy took this task and did, I think, a great job conducting tons of interviews, research, talked to many people, some of them here, and I'm really grateful for your efforts to help us to put together this report. And I have to say that this report is not just his personal view, not just CGI personal view, not my personal view. We just try to put together common wisdom, if you will, of American, part of at least American political foreign policy establishment. Because Andy did talk to many key people trying to see how things will go on from now. As some of you probably know, Vladimir Putin gave today his annual report in Moscow, and surprisingly, he was extremely soft on criticizing America and the West. Unlike last year and 2 years ago, he spent little time on foreign affairs and didn't really say anything nasty about the United States, which also can be a kind of sign from Moscow that they're really looking forward to try to improve those relations. So we'll do it this way. Andy will talk for like 15, 20 minutes. Then we'll have great Wayne Mary to challenge Andy in every possible way. And then we'll give chance Andy to respond, and maybe they will have some interactions and peaceful. Then we'll have a floor open for questions from you guys. And then again, we'll have drinks and more food, as I promised. So let me turn the phone to Andy. Do you want to talk from here, or you want to take a...
I can talk from here.
Powerful, but okay.
Thank you very much, Kolya, for the generous introduction. We are old and dear friends. And before I talk a bit about the report, let me just first of all extend my thanks to Kolya and the superb CGI staff, Olga Kuzmina, Michael Purcell, and Alec Albright, who worked very, very hard with me over the last months to produce this report. I want to acknowledge, in particular, the 42 experts and policymakers, very, very experienced with the relationship over the past 25 years that I interviewed in Russia and in Washington and in California over the last 6 months. They were extremely generous with their time and their insight, and it helped to inform me tremendously as I wrote the report. I also want to thank the many reviewers of the draft who provided invaluable critique and suggestions on how to improve the draft, and they're all acknowledged in the report itself. I also want to acknowledge my Georgetown research assistants, Kate Baum and Ava Kim, for their indispensable support, and also the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Georgetown University, who provided the right environment for me to be able to allocate the kind of time that I did to this. I'll be frank, I didn't expect it was going to be this hard. And in fact, you know, Kolya approached me about 6 months ago or so, and I readily agreed. Looking back on it, if I knew how dang hard it was going to do to write this report, I would have followed Nancy Reagan's advice and just said no. But, you know, there was motivation for me to really try to get a deeper understanding of just how the heck we Russians and Americans, and I mean that, we Russians and Americans, have screwed up this relationship so badly over a quarter of a century, to the point where we talk about having transitioned from a Cold War to something that feels, in some ways, like a new Cold War, except, as I'm going to argue, I think that the current situation is more dangerous, and it's different in important ways from the Cold War. As one U.S. interviewee memorably put it to me, Andy, it's not as bad as it seems. It's worse. You know, this is a much deeper crisis today than the cyclical downturns that have blighted every U.S. administration efforts with Russia, from the Clinton administration to the George W. Bush administration to the Obama administration. I mean, just note the atomic clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a marker of the level of the danger of nuclear war, is today at 3 minutes before midnight. The last time that clock was at 3 minutes before midnight was in 1983, 1984, when it was one of the peak dangerous moments of the Cold War. That's what we have gotten to, and I think everybody that I interviewed with, and as well as myself, was, you know, I think motivated by the sense that, you know, we have reached a very, very, very dangerous place in this relationship, and we need to think quite hard about how we can possibly extricate ourselves from it. And nobody I interviewed, nor I, believes there's any quick fix, there's no magic bullet, there's no grand bargain that can remedy the situation. But rather, I think it's going to take a very painstaking diplomatic process, first to reduce the level of risks currently in the relationship, let alone to restore a modicum of trust. So let's start and look at, you know, what are the similarities and differences between today's situation and the Cold War. Similarities. One, well, this is the Cold War nuclear legacy. Mutually assured destruction with weapon systems set on very short decision times, and that still exists. While the numbers on each side have lessened considerably, the structure is still the same. Yet both of our societies seem to have forgotten about nuclear dangers to some extent, and the threat of Armageddon is still there. As one of the very experienced interviewees put it to me, we are sleepwalking on nukes. Two, the projection of the other as the principal adversary and threat. We have returned to that kind of relationship. Both in official documents, the Russians are a little bit less explicit about it, more referring to NATO rather than the United States, but also the statements by U.S. and Russian officials about threat perception. Three, there is the return of what many international relations theorists called in the Cold War the security dilemma to Europe as the primary front. And so there's a remilitarization going on right now in the European theater after more than 20 years of demilitarization. And each side's moves, we describe our moves as defensive, but they're interpreted by the other side as offensive. And so this is a rather vicious and unregulated spiral of increasing threat perception. Also very similar to the Cold War. What's different? Well, there are some important differences. The Cold War was a global bipolar rivalry that divided the international system into two camps and a group of non-aligned countries. Today's confrontation takes place in a more multipolar environment, or a shifting international environment with military conflict mainly limited to Eurasia and neighboring regions, but complicated also by a very complex struggle in cyber and information space. Substance. ideology. The Cold War was rooted in a deep ideological rivalry between capitalist and socialist systems, which competed to shape the world under their respective systems. This conflict is not quite so ideological, but there is a significant identity component to it, and that we are identifying each as more as others. And of course, there are competing interests. There's a great asymmetry in the relationship. The balance of power is far more in favor of the United States than it was during the Cold War. I mean, the Russian GDP in nominal dollar terms is about 7.4% of U.S. GDP. Purchasing power parity terms, less than 20%. So I think this means, on the one hand, that Russian goals may be more constrained, but it also may be driving Mr. Putin to be less risk-averse as he calculates and attacks our weak points in the conflict today, which is noted by competition across the board. 4, in the Cold War, there was not really, once the Berlin Wall went up, and there was not so much of a gray zone in Europe. Today there is a gray zone in Europe, and there's a lot of contestation over that gray zone in Europe. And the obvious and most worrisome data points there are, of course, the Georgia and Ukraine wars and the Ukraine situation still going on. The rise of China and Russia's deepening ties with Beijing, they add costs of a hostile relationship with Moscow to overall U.S. foreign security policy posture. There's a lot greater instability in the greater Middle East, an increased prevalence of jihadist-inspired terrorist groups. And there are threats, direct threats to the U.S., Russian, and European homelands, which is somewhat different from the Cold War. And finally, to return to a topic that has been very, very hot over the last few months and in the presidential campaign here, and that is the competition in cybersecurity and over information space. There's a high dependence, high vulnerabilities, high capabilities, and pretty much this area is unregulated from espionage. And we saw this see this in commercial ties. Of course, we saw it in the elections recently here. But the much greater risk, of course, is real damage to financial and physical infrastructure that could be caused by either side. So, I mean, just to conclude the introduction, the good news is that this is not, I don't think, a new Cold War. The bad news is that we live in a world where the nuclear legacy of the Cold War still exists, where remilitarization of Europe is taking place in the virtual absence of dialogue on conventional and nuclear arms reductions, where dangerous conventional technologies are blurring the roles of conventional and nuclear arms, and where new cyber offensive military capabilities further increase the risk of greater danger and damage to critical physical and financial infrastructures. So I think the new administration, the incoming Trump administration, and let me just say, when this report was written and when this project was conceived and it was written with pretty much the same recommendations for whoever would have been elected president of the United States. Okay? Just want to state that at the outset. But the new administration, which happens to be the Trump administration, must bring, I think, a greater sense of urgency to address the fundamental risks to U.S. security and foreign policy goals that have arisen from the breakdown in relations with Russia. You know, despite significant disagreements, Russia is perhaps the most important partner for the U.S. in the challenges of nuclear security, preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It's a crucial partner in addressing challenges of European security, international terrorism, cybersecurity, etc. On the other hand, it may be viewed, and it probably is viewed quite a bit today, the major obstacle to meeting those goals. And while it may sound simplistic, and Mr. Trump did say this on the campaign trail, it is fundamentally true that a stronger U.S.-Russia relationship would be a net positive for U.S. interests, European interests, and those of our Asian allies, in the interests of global security at large. But the Trump administration should not underestimate how difficult this is going to be to remedy the relationship. The problems did not just start in 2014. They did not just start in 2012. They can't simply be attributed to the character and policies of Vladimir Putin, although that is a significant component of this. And he's a very challenging interlocutor. So I think it'll be useful to spend a few moments looking at the DNA, so to speak, of this relationship going back to 1991 and the core drivers of Russian foreign policy as I see it before we get to a sense of the prescription and how to move forward. And, it starts with, for me, that going back to 1991, it was a really, really, really bad setup for the U.S. Russia relationship. And this is kind of a structural argument. And it starts with, I think, the distinction between the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the end of the Cold War, that was a negotiated settlement between U.S., European allies, the USSR, the signature moment being the reunification of Germany. And it was emphasized in 1991 with the Soviet support for the first Gulf War. But from the U.S. standpoint, this was more of a negotiation with an equal, if weakening, partner. The collapse of the USSR, however, created a real structural problem. Since then, Russia, from the standpoint of Washington, became one, albeit a very large, piece of a project to expand the liberal democratic order in a broader European context. So several problems emerge in this. First of all, the incentives and the assistance which we had to offer and our European allies were much better suited for smaller and medium-sized countries of East Central Europe. Plus, they were a lot clearer in the direction that they were going, Western integration. Russia, on the other hand, was too large for the kinds of incentives, assistance we had, and it was deeply ambivalent about the direction in which it was going. Then the economic cataclysm which hit the Russian Federation immediately after the collapse, this defeats the reformers, the setbacks and the disappointments for the Russian reformers were more immediate, they were deeper, and this was on top of a lot of greater ambivalence to start out with. So the economic legacy of 74 years of Soviet rule was much more debilitating for the 12 recognized republics of the USSR. Domestic politics of integration got a lot harder. There was mutual disappointment. Russia never lives up to our likely unrealistic expectations, and we do not abide by Russia's implicit understanding of the bargain that we will not take geopolitical advantage of Russian weakness after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And 25 years later, both sides of that implicit bargain are completely shattered. Completely shattered. The integration project, which is what was driving U.S. and Western policy for most of the last 25 years, is over for now and the foreseeable future. And now we're trying to figure out the correct mix of measures of deterrence and containment with engagement to try to get out of the situation. Let me take a brief look at drivers of Russian foreign policy, because that'll help to, I think, shape how we try to move ahead. I think there are four key drivers to Russian foreign policy. The first, it's status, okay? The view of itself as a great power, deserving of respect for its legitimate interests as it sees them. Now, I think we clearly underestimated this factor at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Svetlana Alexievich, a Belarusian writer, wrote a brilliant book that came out last year called Secondhand Time. She describes it as an oral history of the Soviet people. And it's very, very powerful. It's very, very hard to read because of the stories are so tough, but just the sense of the difficulty of adjusting to the disappearance of the country that you grew up in. I mean, for Americans, it's impossible for us to fathom the depth of this kind of trauma, the collapse of the state and the collapse of empire. I think it's easier for Europeans to empathize than it is for us. But it's also a very hard phenomenon to deal with. You know, the definition of a great power is not entirely clear, although we have a better sense of that. Respect, what does that actually entail? Legitimate interests. You know, we had good intentions. I think everybody on the U.S. side, I think on the Russian side for the most part, acknowledges that. But given the structural setup, it was almost impossible, I think, for us to satisfy this sense for Russia that they were a great power, particularly in the 1990s. And two, there's the issue of threat perception. the substantive differences that we have. These are real. They are very real. It starts with Russia's a very traditional sense of territorial security. So it's deeply wired in the Russian DNA. More territory, buffer zones, that this gives you greater security. How do you explain how Russia ever got so large in the first place? It's a longer argument, but it's about this. So the issue of NATO enlargement, that was always going to be a problem. You know, I think that that NATO enlargement I'm not against NATO enlargement. Some of the questions were about timing and questions about how far we went with it. But, you know, there's no real, for the Russian standpoint, there was never going to be a good time for NATO enlargement. And, you know, we need to recognize that and deal with that. Secondly, you know, U.S. NATO use of military power for regime change. I mean, this is a very, very deep difference. It starts with the war in Serbia in 1999, Iraq, Libya, and the prospect in Syria. Democracy promotion, the perception of color revolutions, the Arab Spring. Russians are very cynical in that democracy promotion is being used, at least the official Russian position in the Putin years, is that democracy promotion is being viewed as a fig leaf for the expansion of a U.S.-led liberal hegemonic order. And there are very different perceptions on causality of regime change without, you know, as a result of these revolutions. Missile defense. This is a very, very deep difference. You know, for Russian security, nuclear deterrence, it is the quote-unquote trump card. That's a bridge term. You know, of their security position, and it is very, very difficult for them to accept that our missile defense systems, planned or possibly in the future, are not going to at some point erode the Russian nuclear deterrent. And finally, you know, who is a terrorist? We've had difficulties with that over the years. The third point is, the third driver is an anti-U.S. stance, anti-Western stance for domestic political consolidation. This is also not new. This did not just occur in 2012 when Mr. Putin returned to the presidency. It's always been there right from the beginning. There were always concerns about the possibility of Weimar Russia moving to something that looks like a more fascistic Nazi Germany type Russia. That was a concern in the early 1990s. And so the question of Russian nationalism, what happens with that? So I think there are four key watershed points over the last 16, 17 years. The Serbia war. There was the stark realization in 1999 that, okay, we're against this. NATO is going to do it. We can't stop it. We are powerless. That was big. 2004, Beslan, the terrorist acts, and the Orange Revolution. But this time it was the first really overt use of anti-Americanism, the ideology of the enemy at the gate, those who seek to weaken us, narrative, etc. And again, very different perceptions on causality for the Orange Revolution and regime change in general.
In the winter of 2004, this was the stage of a popular uprising that rivals what we have seen in the Middle East in recent months. A corrupt government defeated, the people's will triumphant.
2011, 2012. Another dramatic turning point. Mr. Putin faced the first socially mobilized opposition, and he was totally taken by surprise by this and the demonstrations that emerged after the allegations of the falsified Duma elections. Kolya and I were there at the fall of 2011 Valdai meeting, and I think there was no indication that Mr. Putin had any idea that there could be some kind of socially mobilized opposition as a result coming up. He was totally blindsided by that. And we know what the response was. It was to blame the United States, blame the State Department, blame Hillary Clinton, blame the intelligence services, etc. simultaneously at that time, the Obama reset was failing, had already been failing, over differences over missile defense, over differences over the Arab Spring, particularly over Libya. Libya was a signature moment as well, where the Russian perception was they abstained on the UN Council Security Resolution for the no-fly zone, but, and again, at Valdai in 2011, Mr. Putin, he got emotional about a couple of things. One of them was the fate of Muammar Gaddafi, and that was a rude violation, a grubaya narushение, of the agreed no-fly zone on the UN Security Council that resulted in the death of Muammar Gaddafi. And my interpretation of what Mr. Putin was telling us that night was, what happened to Muammar Gaddafi will not happen to Bashar al-Assad over my dead body. It was a pretty clear message that we heard, and we should not be surprised about the Russian position for the last 5 years on Syria in that regard. Finally, 2014, and here's where things really went off the charts, where the anti-U.S., anti-Westernism, foreign policy in general becomes a much more significant piece of the domestic political consolidation for Mr. Putin's authority in Russia. So the anti-Western stance, but substantive differences, sense of a great power, and then the last issue, distrust. Am I speaking too long? How are we doing here? A couple minutes. I haven't got to the recommendations yet. Okay. All right. It gets to the last driver, because it is kind of the culmination. That's distrust. The distrust in the relationship. I mean, there is absolutely no trust. And this is almost built into the DNA of the relationship right from the very beginning. It goes back to the negotiations for the reunification of Germany, in which Mr. Gorbachev was basically told orally, given oral, informal assurances, and that his understanding was that NATO would not expand its borders beyond Germany. Now, this was never written. There's an excellent article in International Security, spring of 2016, which goes through this, and that this was a clear part of our negotiating strategy to get Mr. Gorbachev to agree to German reunification, have him believe that NATO would not expand, that NATO would become a more political organization, and that the OSCE would become the principal security organization in Europe. That's what we told them, okay? Now, that's not exactly what happened. So the Russians have a genuine beef there with that. And then you put on top of that, things like the justification for the Iraq War, what happened in Libya, and this makes it this distrust issue is very, very deep. It's not just because Mr. Putin, is a KGB trained professional, but it permeates a lot of the Russian elite. So if you think about how are we going to, if we were to promise a deal on Ukraine that would involve say a moratorium for 10 years on Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, it's going to be much, much harder for that to be believable. All right. So what's the recommendations? Okay, the recommendation, elevation and calibration. Let me just briefly explain what that means. This will leave more time for discussion and for Wayne to elaborate much more eruditely than myself. So elevation. Look, Russia is a great power. It is, a major obstacle or a major facilitator for the United States to achieve many of our most important security goals. So I think elevate the relationship. And this may help to defuse a bit the sense of the status dilemma, the feeling of deprivation of status, which is deep for Mr. Putin and for Russia. I think the relationship is deserving of consistent top-level engagement. It's essential to getting things done. There is consensus on that in the interviews on both the Russian side and the American side, that the presidential channel, the top channel, is absolutely essential. It began to break down in 2013 over the Snowden debacle, and I think some loss of interest on the part of Mr. Obama, and some chemistry issues between the two of them, but treat Russia more like a great power. Les Gelb, in a very good piece that he wrote in 2015, he called this mountaintop diplomacy. Make it visible. This is the extent that we may have any leverage with Mr. Putin. It is that this is it. Give more status, but we do not have to concede on any core interests. It means engaging, possibly show that we can solve problems, but don't expect any quick results. Now, in the report, I proposed a strategic dialogue on nuclear security, terrorism, and cyber as three core issues that the United States and the Russian Federation have a lot of equity on, a lot of vulnerability on, and we absolutely need to be talking. A lot of channels were cut off after Crimea and the breakdown in Ukraine in 2014, and to some extent, closing off these channels, military ties, the NATO-Russia relationship, things like this. These should not be seen as rewards to Russia. We do these things because we see that the communication is in our national interests. And the lack of communication increases the risks and dangers of something bad happening. Okay. The other part of the recommendation is calibration. And that's about, I'll just say one word about this, and we can talk more specifically about the core issues in discussion. I'm sure that Wayne will bring them up. It's about, we're in a security dilemma, okay? So a lot of people are arguing that we need to contain Russia. We need to deter Russia. Well, yes, there needs to be greater elements of containment and deterrence on areas where Russia is threatening our core interests. But straight up containment and deterrence is not going to do it. When you're in a security dilemma, that's only going to exacerbate the problem. So that's why the simultaneous call is for engagement at a high level. Don't expect quick results. You need to be patient. You need to be very, very competent and persistent and professional. And let's test the proposition. Some people think that Mr. Putin has basically kind of gone over the edge, and that it is impossible to deal with him. That we can't get a resolution of Ukraine. That we can't get cooperation in Syria or in other places. Let's test the proposition. And if we find out that we're not able to be successful, the key to calibration then is, okay, then you adjust. If the threat seems to increase, you adjust and you move more to contain and deter. But let's test the proposition and see whether it's possible to have some kind of modest breakthrough. I'm not calling this a reset. This is not a strategic partnership. This is simply an effort to begin to pull us back from the brink of a very, very, very dangerous conflict, which would be extremely detrimental for all of us. Sorry to go on a bit too long.
Do you want to speak from here or from there? Well, we have two great experts, probably the best experts on U.S.-Russia relations. Everybody knows Wayne Murray. He doesn't need to be introduced. Only thing I would like to mention, that all this time Andy was talking about post-Soviet history of U.S.-Russia relations, Wayne was one of the guys who was analyzing it from American side and gave it a lot of very deep and serious conclusions, and probably can challenge Andy on many things. But I would like you to challenge him on current status of the relations and recommendations he gave in this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai. I'm not going to challenge Andy at all. I'm going to supplement him, hopefully, a little bit. Andy was kind enough to ask me to look at his report when it was in draft. And I told him two things. One, I thought was terribly important, and I wanted to help make sure that people in the new administration at all levels would see it. And by all levels, I mean both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean the media. I mean new senior officials. I mean continuing professionals who are already in office and will stay in office. I think what Andrew has produced is a very, very fundamental statement of how we need to rethink this relationship. The second thing I told him was that I particularly welcomed the emphasis that he gave in his report to the danger of nuclear war, because along with a considerable number of colleagues both here and in Moscow, I'm someone who in recent months has felt a sense of absolute dread at the direction in which our two countries have been going. And that's what I'm going to talk about. In part because since Bruce Blair is not going to be here, he's not in a position to try to put the fear of nuclear war into you, which I'm sure he would have done. Now, I think it's a terribly bitter irony that an American president who was welcomed into office with the Nobel Peace Prize is leaving office with, as Andy says in his report, are two countries at the highest risk of nuclear conflict since 1983. I remember 1983 vividly. I spent the first 9 months of that year in Moscow at the American Embassy, and I can remember being awake at night, literally in fear of nuclear war. I then was part of the American diplomatic team at the UN in New York and the Security Council that dealt with the Korean airliner shoot-down, a tangible manifestation of the problems of miscommunication that existed between the two countries. We didn't know until later that in November of that year, the two sides came within a hair's breadth of actual nuclear conflict over the Soviet misperception of what was going on in the NATO Able Archer exercise. But thinking back on 1983, it is horrifying to me that we should be here today in 2016 with the same kinds of problems, the same kinds of mutual misperceptions, and that danger should be with us again. Part of that has to do with nuclear arsenal modernizations, but what it really has to do with is the overall deterioration of the bilateral relationship, which Andy has spoken about. Now, I don't want to minimize or denigrate in the slightest Russia's contribution and responsibility in the mess we're in. But we're here to talk about American policy. So I'm going to focus on that. And the new U.S. administration is going to inherit a Russian policy, which in my view has three principal components: containment, isolation, and regime change. The mechanism of containment being NATO, the mechanism of isolation being sanctions, and the mechanism of regime change being our continuing efforts to try to foment what the Russians call a color revolution in Russia. Now, we know that Mr. Trump has said very clearly that he disapproves of regime changes in American policy pretty much across the board, and specifically with relationship to Russia. And I have no doubt that as president, he will give his Russian counterpart assurances that regime change is not part of his policy. There will be real questions on the Russian side, however, whether that change of policy extends beyond the walls of the Oval Office. And that's going to be a real problem of making any change in American policy tangible throughout the U.S. government and at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, Mr. Trump has also made clear in a number of different ways his general dislike of sanctions as an element of international policy. In the case of Russia, I would argue that the problems with the sanctions are not just that they're beginning to fall apart, as we've seen in attitudes among a number of European and East Asian governments, but that they're counterproductive in two important ways. First, they haven't isolated Russia. They've tended to push Russia into China's embrace in ways that certainly do not serve American interests. And second, they've tended to compound what, to me, has been in recent years the tendency of the Russian state, the Russian держава, to turn inward on itself. Now, American administrations from Truman through Reagan always sought to counter that kind of self-isolation by Russia, to try to open it up, to try to bring light in, not to try to shut the place off from the outside world. That we are now trying to contribute to that self-isolation strikes me as extraordinarily unwise. On containment, I think the problem there is the need for self-containment by NATO. It's NATO that has expanded. And it's NATO which has expanded in ways that have created a perception in Russia of a threat to what in Moscow is perceived to be a vital national interest. You can debate whether or not it is truly a vital national interest, but it is the sovereign right of every state to make that determination itself. And okay. And there's no question in my mind that I can't be any closer to it. I'm practically touching it. No. Well, can you hear? All right. Right. Now, it is no secret. No. I don't think it's not really that secret that a number of major NATO member states, European states, have taken the view within NATO councils that the commitments given at Bucharest in 2008 to Georgia and to Ukraine were a mistake and are a dead letter within the alliance now. I think it would be entirely reasonable for the new U.S. administration not only to adopt that as a policy, but to do it publicly, to recognize that NATO enlargement for those two countries is not going to happen, to get away from the unfortunate habit of making promises to countries which neither the alliance nor the United States is either willing or able to carry out, and to recognize that the Bucharest commitments were a blunder of first magnitude and should be corrected. Now, I have written in a number of contexts that I think both Europe and the United States have a profound moral commitment to Ukraine that we've taken on, particularly the Europeans because of their blunders in their Eastern Partnership program. But I think above all, we should have a commitment not to turn Ukraine into a proxy battlefield between Russia and the West. And when I hear people in this city talking about Ukraine being useful as Afghanistan was to weaken Russia, I wonder exactly whose side they are really on. Now, I think there are 4 specific issues that I think need to be brought to the attention of the new American administration in their relations with Russia. The first is the profound asymmetry in nuclear doctrine between that country and ours. Because in Washington, we tend to mirror image and assume that the Russians think about nuclear weapons the way we do. They do not. They have a strategic nuclear arsenal, superpower arsenal of the kind we have, which is used to deter us and is governed by the rules of mutual assured destruction. They have a second nuclear arsenal, which is about regional deterrence, which reflects the fact that Russia, unlike the United States, is a very large geographic country with many peripheral security issues and does not remotely fill its own geographic space, either demographically or economically. And that the solution to that security problem are regional nuclear weapons and the deterrence that follows from those. Unfortunately, that kind of deterrence requires the willingness and the perceived willingness to use those nuclear weapons, even in response to non-nuclear threats. And that's true in places like Ukraine. And we need to understand that people in Moscow are potentially willing to use that category of nuclear weapons in circumstances which we, with our massive conventional military superiority, would never even consider. Second, I think we need to understand that for Moscow, the most important tipping point in the deterioration of the relationship between our two countries in the last 25 years was the U.S. unilateral choice to abrogate the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This is almost never even thought about in this city. I am well aware of the breadth and intensity of feeling in many parts of the American political culture about ballistic missile defense. But if we speak the truth when we say, as we do, that these ballistic missile defense programs are not about Russia and are not aimed to denigrate Russian security, then I think the new administration should be willing to engage in a very genuine dialogue with Russia to try to find a bilateral mutual accommodation on ballistic missile defense. I understand perfectly that that's trying to square a circle, and it is probably not achievable. But I think even a genuine effort from the United States to communicate with Russia on ballistic missile defense would have very positive outcomes in its own right. And by genuine dialogue, I mean one in which the United States is actually willing to listen and not, as heretofore, only to lecture. Third, we should never, ever underestimate Russian fear and Russian paranoia about strategic decapitation. The Pearl Harbor mentality that existed in our country during all the Cold War is a spit in the bucket compared to the equivalent mentality that exists on the Russian side and still exists. And it is focused in particular on the development by the United States of technologies within the program known as Prompt Global Strike, of what they see as a capacity for weaponized regime change. Now, I would argue that anybody in Washington who would even talk about trying to do such a thing with respect to Russia should be in a straitjacket. I'm also aware that there are people in this city outside the walls of St. Elizabeth Hospital who do, and that there are people in Moscow who are well aware of it and who are drawing conclusions from it. And I think one of the most important things that a Trump administration will need to do is to be able to persuade Moscow that we are not, in fact, preparing a capability for that purpose. Fourth, and finally, I think there needs to be a really conscious effort from our side, from the new U.S. administration, to change the tone of the relationship. The malice, the mutual malice which pervades not only diplomatic, but all kinds of public interaction between our two countries is appalling. We never did that during the Cold War. I mean, I was involved in American relations with Russia going back to Nixon. And even at the worst part of the Reagan years of the first administration, Ronald Reagan never spoke about his Soviet counterparts in ways that we now routinely do about the leadership of the Russian Federation. And I have proposed in a number of places that the new administration needs to agree with the Kremlin on what I would call an absence of malice pact, in which the governments would undertake just to reduce the tone of vilification and use their influence with their respective medias to just try to get people to restore a degree of civility and dignity into the mutual dialogue, which I think is an essential component to be able to deal with other problems. Now, God knows I have no way of predicting what the new U.S. administration will actually do in its relations with Russia. I think it will find that it will have as many problems within its own ranks, within the U.S. government, and with the Congress in terms of trying to change a policy toward Russia, as it will have in dealing with Moscow itself. But Mr. Trump has said on a number of occasions, he's asked, wouldn't it be nice if we could get along with Russia?
You said, if he says great things about me, I'll say great things about him.
Well, look, I don't know him, and know nothing about him really. I just think if we got along with Russia, that's not a bad thing, and and getting along with other countries.
No, sir. Not nice. Absolutely essential. A fundamental aspect of our responsibility as a great power is to get along with other great powers, particularly those possessing large arsenals of nuclear weapons. If Mr. Trump, against all of the probabilities and the resistance that he will encounter in this city, let alone the difficulties of dealing with Moscow on these issues, if he can actually make real progress on the things that I've spoken about and Andy has spoken about, a few years from now, he may warrant his own nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize.
Молодец.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Andy said he has one comment on that, and then we'll open for the questions.
I'm humbled by Wayne's insight and wisdom, but just to, I think, to only further emphasize his point, it was an important realization for me. Here we are in this kind of 1983 analogous sort of level of threat period, and Ronald Reagan was the president at the time, and this insight comes from David Hoffman's brilliant book, The Dead Hand, which I recommend to everybody, and there is a nice recommended reading list in the end of the report. But Reagan was told by his briefers that the Soviets, and particularly Mr. Andropov, who succeeded Leonid Brezhnev, actually believed that the United States was preparing for a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. And he thought that was ludicrous. I mean, how could anybody possibly believe that the United States was preparing for a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union? That would be Armageddon. It would be mutual assured destruction. But after a while, he came to understand that, well, actually, this was the mindset for the Andropov regime or government, and not only for Mr. Andropov. And it was that realization that scared the daylights out of him and led him to think that he needed to start reaching out to the Soviet leadership. This is even before his ultimate partner came to power, Mr. Gorbachev, in rather remarkable ways. And the analogy to today, I think, is thinking about Mr. Putin. What is the number one thing that Mr. Putin fears? Well, I think it is regime change. I think he genuinely does believe that the United States seeks regime change in Russia and would love to unseat him. I don't think that, this may sound like paranoid fantasy to us, but I think maybe this actually is his framework. And if that is his framework, then that's something very, very important for the incoming administration to take very, very seriously and to try to defuse. And as Wayne said, it's a starting point. And it's a starting point about talking to Russia in a different way, in a respectful way, in a business-like way, in a non-threatening way. It is really amazing to me almost that it seems like the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, seems to get more respect in the U.S. press than Vladimir Putin to some extent. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. And using my power of moderator, I will ask first question. When I do participate in a lot of Russian discussions like that. And usually when people talking about how things are bad and U.S.-Russia relations goes down, usually the conclusion they came to is like, we have two leaders, they should sit down, talk over, and straighten things up, and everything will be fine from then. It's like your mountaintop idea. Let's two people sit, we have Trump, Russians love Trump, Putin loves Trump, Trump loves Putin. They can make relations better almost right away, or not right away, but for sure they can make relations better. But then I remember that the same thing I heard about Obama, who wanted to improve relations with Russia, first couple years of his presidency. And Putin was on Medvedev. Remember, President Medvedev was like really open for American. I remember then George Bush Jr., who was a friend with Mr. Putin. They were fishing together, visiting each other's birthdays, had nice relations. So they wanted to improve relations. And of course, George Bush the Senior wanted to improve relations, and he was a great friend of Yeltsin, and then Clinton, of course, was the best friend of Boris Yeltsin. So good relation between, understanding between two leaders seems to me never really work for improving the relations between two countries. And I don't know why. Every American president came to White House with idea to improve relations with Russia. Every Russian leader come to Kremlin with idea to improve relations with Kremlin. It's usually take a year or so, 2 years maybe to realize it doesn't work, and then everything goes downhill again. So what is the secret in U.S.-Russia relations? Why we can't really, should we rely on two leaders like to solve our problems? So we have so different national interests, even two our leaders cannot, kind of coordinate them. We always end up as enemies, not even as partners. And good relations with two, now we hope, like Putin said good things about next American president. Trump said good things about Putin, now we're kind of fine. I doubt, and a couple years from now, we probably will talk about new crisis in U.S.-Russia relations. What's wrong with the concept of our relations? What should we do? Not to rely on two leaders, two people, a group of people in both cities to improve it. Thank you.
Yeah, you see?
That was a question?
Yes.
Wake up.
Okay. Well, look, the nature of the Russian political system, highly centralized, and as it is, it puts more emphasis on the leader-to-leader relation, I think, than in some other relationships that we may have with other allies, partners, and quasi-adversaries. A good personal relationship between leaders, however, is no guarantee, obviously, that we can overcome some of the more fundamental, deep-seated differences that I emphasized are real in the relationship. And I think one of the points that Wayne brought up, ballistic missile defense. I mean, this has been a thorn in the relationship 30 years. 30 years ago in Reykjavik, Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev almost agreed to mutually eliminate nuclear weapons. What held up the agreement was that Mr. Reagan was not willing to give up even what that time was a nascent kind of an incubator program on missile defense in the laboratory that hardly existed, more on paper. And that thwarted it. And the failure to reach an accommodation on missile defense in the spring of 2011, again, was a major factor in undoing the reset, along with the Arab Spring and along with the question of political succession in Russian domestic politics. So I think that, at least as Wayne said, an effort to try to, let's put this back on the table. But there's going to be tremendous opposition in his own party. I mean, for Republicans, missile defense is a much stronger priority than it has been for Democrats. It's why I thought it would be easier for Mr. Obama coming in 8 years ago, because the missile defense issue, which was very prominent for the George W. Bush administration, as well as the NATO expansion issue, which was off the table because of the Georgia war anyway at that time, would help to facilitate things for the reset. And they did. But it's, this is, getting to the point of security. And the bottom line for the Russians is their nuclear deterrent. And that is essential, and they see our missile defense programs as threatening. So I think there's some potential, to defuse the dangerous level of the relationship that we're at right now. But do I think that there is an imminent resolution of the Ukraine issue? It'll be very, 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 very difficult. Are we going to get back to an agreement about strategic stability, including missile defense, including the role of conventional weapons that have first strike capabilities? That's going to be very, very difficult. So, turn it over to Wes. Keep expectations modest.
Personalities certainly play a big role in international affairs than they used to, because of all these damn summit meetings and phone calls. I mean, back in the days of sailing ships, diplomacy was in some ways a lot easier. But one should not forget that even very strong leaders are, in many respects, the prisoners of their environments and their staffs. I once organized a meeting between the presidents of Azerbaijan and Armenia. and they got along fine. The problem was that each of them had a staff that was terrified that their boss was going to make peace. And I certainly agree with Andy that one of the things about the Russian system is that it is so centralized on the senior leader that without his pushing things, nothing happens in the system. I think in our system, the problem is that we have become almost so monolithic in the Russophobia that is one of the few things that is truly bipartisan in this city. And it's one of the things in which the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, all seem to be able to agree on. That the new administration, if it really wants to improve the relations with Russia, I think is literally going to have more trouble in this city than it will have in Moscow. And it will have to be very cautious not to give the appearance that it is somehow being taken advantage of and conned by a clever Vladimir Putin. But that doesn't mean that you cannot do things which, in the American system, a president can direct. And I can tell you one thing, that in any U.S. administration, when the President of the United States says, I want this and I want this by a certain date, or it will be your head, that people who've only recently taken new positions in Washington tend to be extremely responsive to that. I think we have seen, in fact, during the limited period of the transition, that there are a lot of people who really want to be in political offices in Washington and will do practically anything that the president-elect asks them to do. And that will be true even more so, I think, for a president. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I do think there are some basic things about nuclear safety, about getting away from this situation that resembles 1983 that we should never have gotten into in the first place. Those are things which a commander-in-chief can make happen. The more broader problems of trying to have a mutually productive relationship, that's going to take time. But that's why I suggested that the first thing they need to do is to agree on a absence of malice agreement in which they just take their own governments and their own media and try to tone down the vitriol that has become so characteristic. I mean, one of the things I remember with former boss of mine, Ambassador Jack Matlock, who worked for Ronald Reagan, knew Reagan very well, points out that Ronald Reagan never sought regime change in Moscow. He sought regime behavior change. And he understood that if you threaten another government's existence, whether at a broad level or individual level, your ability to bring about positive behavior change goes to zero. Surely we can understand that today. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, guys, if you have any questions, we have. So who wants to start?
You have to acknowledge.
Yeah, go ahead, guys.
Please say your name.
Just introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Hi. Thank you. First, I have a general comment and then a specific question. I really want to applaud both Andy and Wayne. So much of the conversation in this town, in this country, about Putin and Russian behavior is, oh, they're doing something that we don't like, that's contrary to our interests. That's outrageous. And virtually every sentence from the two of you is about their interests and their perception of what's going on, both in the terms of the regime interest of Putin and the national interest of Russia. And I really hope that President Trump will listen to that kind of perspective. Now, my very specific question, I guess, is for you, Andrew. You uttered a sentence that really struck me. I think the way you put it was, we saw what you did to Mr. Gaddafi, and you're not going to do it to Mr. Assad. And I guess I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that moment, the spring of 2011. I remind you, as you undoubtedly know, there was actually a UN Security Council resolution. It was under this UN principle of responsibility to protect. And the resolution said we're going to prevent the Gaddafi regime from inflicting atrocities on its own on its own citizens. And then the first thing they did was drop a bomb on Gaddafi's house. And I remember the Russian government being outraged and said, this is not what we voted for. We voted to prevent the regime from inflicting atrocities, not to remove the regime. And it seems to me that that's something that, would you elaborate a little bit more on that particular moment? I think Moscow felt enormously betrayed by that, and we're still feeling the repercussions of that today.
Sure, let's do a couple of questions. You want to go on this side?
Yeah.
You want to go on this side?
Okay, guys. We'll change sides.
Hello, Daniel Robinson. I'm a freelance blogger. Anyway, I just have a quick question for the whole panel. Is there a fear that your report may be construed as giving Russia a pass when it comes to human rights issues? Because it seems as though that many of the recommendations you make are specifically tailored to a few, narrow strategic focuses, and it made me think of that essentially that, that in terms of a strategic dialogue that the U.S. could pursue with Russia, it seems a little more akin to, say, China in terms of the U.S. relationship with them, essentially kind of sublimating human rights issues or issues about political prisoners, dissidents, and what have you. So, could you talk to that about concerns that could be misconstrued that way?
Okay, thank you. One more. Okay, I know you.
Oleg Merkulov, Business Multimedia Group from Riga, Latvia. So in Latvia, a lot of officials were shocked to find out that Trump won, so they had to adjust their policy right now. So what recommendations would you give to Latvian government? They have only a few weeks before the Trump will assume take power. It will be inaugurated. And what do you say about that?
Thank you. Okay, guys, you ready?
Okay. Latvia, Europe in general. In the report, very specific that Mr. Trump should actually make his first trip to Europe. And there needs to be reassurance of our European allies. Because of some of the things that he said on the campaign trail, questioning NATO's Article 5 credibility, etc. At a time when Russia is threatening NATO member countries in dangerous ways, this is not a time to be thinking about, reviewing the existing commitments that we have. Those must be assured and strengthened on the part of Mr. Trump. And I was disappointed. It was good that he had a phone call about 10 days ago with Mr. Putin, but it was a striking contrast that it was Mr. Obama who made, on the eve of his trip to Europe, the commitment, to our NATO allies. So I think Mr. Trump, this is part of the calibration, okay? In some areas there does need to be a greater deterrence and a greater sense for the Russians that I don't think the Russians are frankly preparing to challenge Article 5 credibility for the Baltic states or other NATO members. But we need to ensure that they understand that we're actually deadly serious about that while trying to reach out. It's trying to find this mixture of some enhanced deterrence and containment while engaging and trying to defuse. On human rights and democracy, there is a recommendation, of course, that we do try to hold Russia to its commitments on human rights and democracy that it has made. But on the other hand, we have particularly on democracy and on elections, we have no influence, no positive influence. I think for Russian opposition candidates, for a more plural Russian system. And the recommendation is there, maybe we just kind of take a pause on democracy promotion in Russia. Because frankly, it hasn't been working, okay? And even opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Milov, and others have told me and told others that, look, our association with the United States, being perceived by being associated with the United States, is more of a danger and a risk for us. It's more of a negative for us. On the Gaddafi moment, well, I think I was pretty clear. I think that was a watershed moment. I know Obama administration officials have told me that, yes, they briefed Mr. Medvedev about UN Security Council resolution and the plans. They did not brief Mr. Putin. Well, that was probably an oversight and not a good oversight. But it was, I think it was, the Obama administration was in a difficult position because their natural interlocutor was Mr. Medvedev at the time, and often Mr. Putin would tell them, "Hey, look, go talk to Dmitry Anatolievich. That's his business. It's not mine." But I think certainly it was the Russian perception of the violation of what they had signed on to with the abstention that had a very, very deep impact on Mr. Putin. It had an impact, I think, on the prospects for Mr. Medvedev's possible re-election as candidacy, along with the failure of the missile defense negotiations as well. There were several things that conspired, I think, in the spring of 2011 to both spoil the reset and to undermine Mr. Medvedev's chances to remain as leader of Russia, or at least de jure leader of Russia.
On the Gaddafi incident, I think we need to recognize that that was the beginning of the end of Mr. Medvedev's potential for ever becoming seriously the president of Russia, in fact as well as in name. It's also true that the Russians were disturbed not just by what happened to Gaddafi, but our exultant taking credit for it. I mean, they didn't just see the video of Gaddafi's death. They saw that video of the interview that Secretary Clinton gave, where she said, "We came, we saw, he died," and that gave a very bad impression to the Russians, I think. Now, my advice to the Latvian government would be to take a Valium. I think you people working yourselves into a frenzy that need not exist. I think the chances that Russia is going to violate the territory of a NATO Article 5 member state are extraordinarily low. I mean, even when the Turks shot down a Russian aircraft, they didn't react in any way that could potentially have triggered an Article 5 response. I mean, I think, now, does that mean that they're going to create degrees of tension and anxiety for you? Yes, but if you do it to yourself, you simply make their job somewhat easier. Now, democracy promotion in Russia. We have heard a lot of mostly nonsense in recent months about the Russians interfering in our democratic processes and in our election. We've been doing that in Russia for a quarter of a century. And I mean very actively. I was part of it when I was in the American embassy. I mean, we brought in institutions, we brought in money, we specifically supported certain candidates. We had strategies to undermine other candidates. We dictated who should be on electoral lists. We didn't just do that in the 90s. Vice President Biden went to Putin when he was prime minister and told him not to stand again for the presidency. I mean, what business is that of ours? Now, a very talented, famous American diplomat, Chas Freeman, recently pointed out that for a long time, the United States had this notion that the legitimacy of a government derives from the consent of the governed. That's what it says in the Declaration of Independence. But in recent years, we've taken the view that the legitimacy of a foreign government derives from our approval of it. For example, an Egyptian president could have a supermajority in a free and fair national election, but he wasn't legitimate because we didn't approve of it. Now, I don't think there's any question that whatever I may think about the nature of the political system in Russia, and I'm glad I do not live under it, that it does have the very broad consent of the governed. My old friend Dmitry Trenin, the head of the Moscow Carnegie Center, describes the Russian political system as authoritarianism with the consent of the governed. Now, the great majority of the Russian people are prepared to consent to that. I don't see that it's our business to treat that as illegitimate. It may not be our way of governance. It may not be the kind of governments I would want to live under. But I go back to what Thomas Jefferson wrote, that the legitimacy of a government derives from the consent of the governed. And I don't see why we now have a problem with that.
You remind me Russian joke I can share with you. Why a color revolution will never happen in the United States? Because there is no American embassy in Washington. Anyway, okay, let's go another, this side. Anybody? Okay, you guys lucky one. Okay, go ahead.
Ken Margaret, Ruledocs. If President Trump reverses the thaw in our relations with Cuba, do you think we'll see Cuba granting basing rights for Russian long-range bombers?
Okay, well, okay.
Let's Alec. Right here? Okay.
Jonathan Prather. Putin recently said he is seeking to restore Assad's authority throughout the entirety of Syria. In the interest of restoring good U.S.-Russia relations, should the U.S. acquiesce to that, despite the suspicions of war crimes, chemical weapons use, etc.? And if not, what should the Trump administration's position be going forward with relations to Syria?
One more.
I'm Ricky Gandhi, and I was just wondering what the role, if any, of third-party countries should be in trying to help mend the relations between the United States and Russia. I know Germany is often cited. Yeah, third-party countries. So like Germany is often cited, but I'm thinking of like countries maybe like Vietnam or India or other possibly South American countries like Brazil. How can they contribute to try to mend the relations between the United States and Russia? Possibly. Any, like, I guess the question is kind of two-part. What third-party countries can play a role, and what should that role be? And so Germany is often cited, but what about other countries too?
Right, okay. On Cuba basing, I have no idea what the Raul Castro government might do. Keep in mind, this is still a Castro government in Cuba and likely to be for quite a considerable time. They have certainly not done anything like that heretofore. And in fact, when you had a couple of admirals in Moscow talking about basing in Cuba and basing in Vietnam, both governments basically gave them a raspberry. You know, we can't be, you know, we don't want you. Thank you very much. I think the notion that there are many countries around the world looking for the opportunity to base Tupolovs, I think is very low order probability. I mean, I'm willing to be proven wrong on that, but
Nicaragua?
No, I don't. Even there, I think let's not forget that the United States has means of influence in our near abroad countries that we are not too hesitant to make use of. On Assad and Syria, that's an entirely new, broad topic. I don't claim, I've only been in Syria once, and I certainly don't claim to be an expert on it. What I see is a multifaceted civil war that has far too many external actors participating in it. You know, from Qatar and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the United States and Russia. And I will say candidly that I am of the view that American policy in Syria has been extremely short-sighted. It was based on the assumption that the Arab Spring was going to bring about the easy overthrow of the Assad regime and the coming into power of something that we would approve of. That hasn't happened. Russian policy is not really committed to Assad so much as a person as to the integrity of the coalition of Alawites, Christians, the Ba'ath, the military, and the commercial institutions there, because they think that's the only thing that's preventing the coming into power of an Islamic extremist Sunni government. I don't know whether they're right or not. But it seems to me that the Russians at least have a thought-through, coherent policy in Syria. I doubt that they're going to be successful at it. But since the United States does not even have a thought-through, coherent policy, I think the chances of success for us are even lower. Third party. I think there's going to be a number of countries that will be very eager to try to help the new U.S. administration in its relations with Moscow. Probably more than we will want. Probably more than Moscow will want. I suspect that Japan will be one of the most active because they're one of the countries that really does want to see an improvement in their bilateral relations with Russia. They're one of the countries that have paid the highest price for Western sanctions. After the French elections, I suspect that whoever will be in the new occupant of the Élysée will also try to do that. Assuming that Angela Merkel remains Chancellor of Germany, I think that's probably not going to be a very viable intermediary, partly because relations, the personal relations between Putin and Merkel have got so bad, and partly because they both speak each other's language. But I do think that sometimes it's governments you wouldn't think about. I mean, for example, in my experience as a professional diplomat, there's a reason why so much informal diplomacy is done by the Swiss and by Singapore, because they're really good at it and they don't have enough power to actually threaten anybody's interests. So I wouldn't be surprised if it would be somebody like that who might come forward and be of use.
On third parties, just to add to what Wayne said, I mean, even most of the countries, the smaller countries on the periphery of Russia, in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, they would like to see, in principle, a thaw in the relationship. Because when relations between Moscow and Washington are much more hostile, it puts them in a much more complicated position to exercise a multi-vector foreign policy, which they see as essential to help to strengthen their own sovereignty, whether it's Kazakhstan, Georgia, and across the board. And so these countries are victims in the very hostile relationship that we have. I would just add on Mr. Assad that this gets to the larger issue of Mr. Putin and the Russian elite's perception that authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, in weakly institutionalized states, if you take out the authoritarian leader, you take out most of the state authority, and it leads to greater chaos and instability and opening for more Islamist jihadist groups to have more power and influence. And this has been the fundamental difference that we've had with the Russians from the get-go in the beginning of the Arab Spring. The Russians didn't really care that much about Tunisia. They were surprised, though, that we let go our 30-year ally, Hosni Mubarak, so quickly. And with the expectation that democracy would emerge in Egypt and this would be a more stable situation. No, the Russians, virtually every Russian I talked to at the time, in early 2011, they kind of looked at me like, what do you guys think you're doing? You're just opening the door for the Muslim Brotherhood, more radical Islamist groups who have no democratic real interests for the long term in Egypt, and it's going to create more instability, etc. And so I think that for Mr. Putin, certainly this is the experience of watching what happened in Iraq when we took out Mr. Hussein. How did that turn out? What happened in Libya? And then sort of gets to where he drew the red line on Syria. And it's not because I think that the Russians are so beholden to Mr. Assad. Mr. Assad is a very, very, very difficult client, extremely difficult client, whose ambitions are much greater than what the Russians, I think, are ready to support for him. And the irony of the Syrian situation is that the Arab Spring and in Syria, this is much more fundamentally a conflict between Saudi Arabia, its allies, Qatar and others, and Iran. But it's kind of morphed into now a U.S. Russian conflict, which is just really unproductive when we do share some common interests. So there is a possibility, that between now and January 20th, okay, Aleppo is going to go down. Whatever moderate opposition that existed is probably not really going to exist, those that we supported. And there'll be a position where perhaps we can pivot to some accommodation to the reality that Mr. Assad's days are numbered in a much larger number than we certainly anticipated five years ago, which was a tactical and strategic mistake on our part. And somehow have a bit more of a common interest with Russia. This is I can't exactly see how it operationalizes, but this is I'm not advocating. What do I want to say here? This is not because you're going to be accused of well he's a butcher, he's a war criminal, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, he is. And there are a lot of bad guys around. But here we are 5 years later, and I think that we made a fundamental mistake in not engaging with Mr. Assad in the diplomatic process 5 years ago, on the assumption that his days were numbered and he was going to be out of power. As a result, he's still in power. We have the greatest humanitarian catastrophe since World War II. I mean, our Syria policy has been an abject failure.
Okay, thank you, guys. I was told that our time is over, but I invite all of you to have more questions and discussion over drinks back there. And let me thank you, our speakers, for tonight. I think we had a great discussion, and I hope thank you, guys. I hope that in a few months, maybe after Trump's first 100 days, we'll have another discussion and follow up on all these recommendations. And thank you for coming.
Actually, read it.
Yeah, read it, please.
More reports as you leave. There are reports available outside.